Okay, so joining us today is Quayd. He's an English professor focusing on argumentation and research. He volunteers for an organization called Street Epistemology International and has his own channel called What's Your Argument, which spins off from the Street Epistemology discussion technique. He also has a self-titled blog and YouTube channel and multiple projects in the works regarding epistemology and meditation. So welcome, Quayd.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into what street epistemology is, I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about the general definition of epistemology, just to kind of let the audience get a basis for what we're talking about. So, um, if you were to summarize a definition of epistemology, what would it be?
It's basically just the study of knowledge and belief and values, how we come to have knowledge or beliefs or values. I mean, that is essentially it. So, like the way that we study biology, right? That would be like the study of organisms or, uh, carbon-based life, I guess you could say. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, the study of how we come to know things.
Yeah, kind of my understanding based on the research that I did. I guess in the general sense that the definition states that it's the study or theory of the nature or grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits and validity. Um, and so within the traditional epistemology, three examples or models that I found also as well were the relating to truth, belief, and justification, which is really interesting in itself for me because that's kind of a little bit of a basis of what my project, my independent media project is just to kind of, and I think that's kind of also what the street epistemology is about, is kind of coming, like figuring out where people come to their beliefs and seeing kind of like what the stem of that is. So, I guess with that in mind, in your opinion, is there a universal approach to knowledge? Or do you think that there's always going to be some sort of divide in the way populations interact with their perceived ideals?
I actually do go based off of the assumption that there are commonalities that we can use to build knowledge, though we don't tend to use those or think about them. But I do think that it's convenient that it seems that we exist in the same universe and that we evolved similarly, which means we have a lot of the same mechanisms for um, we have the same mechanisms that we use to figure out what's true. So, for instance, we tend to all agree that we can make observations. That's not something that too many people in the world are going to disagree with. And we can use that to build knowledge. Now, within like academic fields or scientific fields, they do build knowledge differently. But that's for mostly superficial reasons. Some people do argue that some studies or fields of knowledge are less legitimate than other ones. Like, for instance, there's a big discussion about gender studies now, or critical theories, things like that. Sociology is sometimes called into question, but all the academic fields do build knowledge in very similar ways at the kind of foundation or fundamentals of it. But once you get into the particulars of like how to run an experiment, that will be different, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't have to divide the different fields. They don't have to be in battle with one another, as long as I feel like the base or the foundation is the same. And then when it comes to people in the public, I do think that we build knowledge differently, but it doesn't have to be that way. Like, we're not usually thinking, how can I come to know something, and let me make that list and really think critically about that list, and then use that when I'm interacting with beliefs and ideas to figure out what I actually should believe, or what I should claim to know. And that is kind of one of the, what you could say, the missions of street epistemology, is to see how people are building that list. And if we're critical of that list, if we can come to the same conclusions about the best ways to build knowledge. And in philosophy, this has already been done. There's still a lot that we don't know, and philosophers highly disagree, especially philosophers of epistemology. They highly disagree on a lot of things. but there are a lot of things that they tend to agree on. And again, so the idea, we tend to just presuppose that this universe exists and everything in it exists. We tend to presuppose that we can make observations about the world and that we can use that to build knowledge. We tend to presuppose that those observations can sometimes be incorrect. So we can hallucinate or dream. There seems to be some way that we can observe things, or we can have this experience of observation, but not actually be observing something. We can make inferences, so we don't have to observe something directly to believe in it. We can observe some other things and kind of build this theory or this idea that something exists. So, like, if you've never been to Australia, you don't have to actually observe the land of Australia, or you don't have to get a plane and be able to observe Australia from space to know, oh, it's there. You can see pictures of it in books or hear people that have traveled there, hear people with accents from Australia, learn some of its history, and you use all that information to come to the conclusion, even though you haven't observed Australia itself, that Australia does exist. And then there are problems with that as well. We recognize that when we're doing that, when we're making an inductive inference, there can be problems there. And so what we have to do at that point is highly collaborate with one another. And we need to check each other. This is verificationism. So if I come to a conclusion, I need somebody else that is also looking at information to look at my conclusion and say, hey, is this conforming to all of the possible information we could look at? And so those are some of the base assumptions, I would say.
Yeah, that kind of leads into my next question about what your ideal way for society to come to agreed ideas and conclusions would be. So the verification would probably be your best answer on that.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of different things, like the idea of observation. This is mainly coming from empiricism, and empiricism is seen as in contrast to rationalism. So empiricists would say we can make observations about the world and come to know what's true. Rationalists would say that's not exactly it. Actually, we can make observations, but we actually have to rationalize what we believe. We can't just, it's not like we look at something and then the information is inputted into our brain and when we see a piece of paper, we just the information that it is paper is put directly into my brain. A rationalist would say you're actually seeing different aspects of observation and you're using prior knowledge and understanding to form almost instantaneously this idea that there's a piece of paper in front of you. But really, we're using components of all those philosophies, in my view. This is something closer to like what's called eclecticism, or you could call it syncretism too, which wouldn't be correct, but it's the idea that there are a bunch of different schools of thoughts, and we use ideas from all those different schools of thoughts. Verificationism is just one of them. So, and we can get into falsifiability. There are a bunch of different ideas that have kind of emerged from this conversation that's happened in philosophy, and I think we should use as many as we deem, I guess, necessary. Yeah, can you repeat the question just one more time? I apologize. What was the exact question?
Yeah, just basically your ideal way for society to come to agreed ideas and conclusions, kind of I mean, I guess, yeah, and with the philosophical basis or like a scientific basis, the verification. But then I guess you could kind of go further with that and think of like possibly policies, because I think there's kind of like a meshing of opinion and verifiable knowledge as well out there. And people are kind of have a hard time distinguishing between those two, on what their opinion might be, and then what's also based within fact and reality as well. So yeah, just kind of like, what the ideal way for you, like even in a hypothetical situation, like if you could mesh your own, if you could build your own world or reality, what would your ideal way for society to come to conclusions be?
Yeah, that would be it then. It would be to update people on the conversation that has gone on in philosophy and for them to utilize those answers. And this isn't going to solve everything. We'll still certainly disagree on many of things, especially when it comes to qualitative things or preferences. These will still exist. There's no scientific way to measure whether or not Saving Private Ryan is better than Pulp Fiction, right? There's just
Yeah.
no way to do that. So we'll still disagree, but we should be able, in my view, to agree on some of the scientific things that emerge from um, the academic or scientific community. So some of the conclusions that they derive um, under the presupposition that they're deriving them based on reasonable means, obviously, but
Yeah.
for us to be able to think about how we know what we know. And I do think we'll come to a lot of the same answers. And then I think we can look at different fields of study and say, are they doing this? From my own study, it seems like the vast majority are. And so I conclude that the conclusions they're coming to are reasonable, and I tend to accept those. And I think, yeah, it would be much better if we could, for instance, have agreed that the coronavirus was an epidemic. I think it would have been better for us as a society to recognize that that was true, and then we could have taken more evasive precautions, let's say. I would have imagined that as better, but there is still this issue, like you were mentioning, of policy. So science can tell us what's true. It can't tell us what to do. So we could all agree. I think if we would have all agreed that it was a pandemic and that the death rate was somewhere around 1%. You hear people giving different figures, giving 0.2% or 0.6%, but they're usually looking at like a single study when they're doing that, rather than the averages, which were somewhere around somewhere around 1% to 1.4%, let's say. That's a big difference when it comes to actual people and the death rate. And I think that we would have handled it just a little bit differently if we could have all concluded that. But I think climate change is a great example that I think of when it comes to this. Is we could conclude that climate change is happening and that it's human caused, and we can conclude these things, but there is still the question of, okay, well, what do we do about it? Do individuals need to do something? Do we need to recycle more? Do we need to have a carbon tax on corporations? And this is stuff where there's no scientific answer that we can really come up with there. These are just solutions to the problem. But again, I think we would live in a much different world if we could at least agree on that and then think, okay, the scientific community seems to have concluded this is true. Now, what do we do about it? We still
Yeah.
seem to be arguing about whether or not it's true.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I think finding that middle ground is really important. Even like kind of just meshing like from two completely opposite extremes. Does it exist at all, or is it like a detrimental issue at the moment? I think there's always within like most issues, I think there's always a middle ground that if we just communicated more about it, and kind of meshed the two sides of extremism into the middle, that there's a lot of ways that we could go about things differently, and think about policy. Because I think in general, even if hypothetically climate change isn't a detrimental immediate danger, recycling is still good, right? We still shouldn't be trashing the planet with things that aren't, able to be biodegradable. So, things like that. So would you say that aside from aspects of extremism, like with thinking within like a tone of sociology as a whole, um, do you think that disagreements can be beneficial or productive, in order to kind of come to those agreed conclusions? Do you think that's just do you think that there's some benefit that comes from disagreeing?
yeah, I think it's a necessary part of the process. Some people will scrutinize what I'm going to say here, but there's, the idea of the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. The synthesis. So the idea is that um, you need people to bring up new ideas that conflict with the old ideas to really make any progress. It takes those new ideas and disagreement to create effective change. We all seem to agree that it's not likely that the way that things are now is the best way. It might be a really good way, but it's not the best way, and it takes people being able to think of a better way for us to make any progress, I would say. Yeah, so I would say that it's integral to the epistemological process.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Um, so I think before we switch gears into what specifically street epistemology is, because it's more of a technique than the general idea of epistemology. But I guess one more question that I'm just curious about, and this is not one that I kind of presented you before, but do you think that certain perspectives are more foundational and brought upon into society? Or do you think that genetics play a bigger role in that? Kind of like what we had talked about in our meeting this week. You had brought up the idea of uh, animals in the wild and the aspect, and I had kind of came back with the aspect that like racism, for example, isn't something that's inherent or it's more of a learned thing that people have like within society that kind of gets imposed upon them. What are your opinions on that?
Um, are you talking about just generally the idea that there are things that are innate in us, or just specifically racism?
I guess the question that I have, the initial question was, do you think that the certain perspectives that people hold are more foundational, or do you think that genetics play a big role?
Okay. I think that it's both, and I can't discern to what degree. And this, I think, goes back to your conversation on the middle ground. It's a good rule of thumb for me, and this is why I take the approach I do when I'm engaging with people. I deal with arguments. I don't deal with claims or groups. I just want to know, what's your claim and what reasons do you have for those claims? And is that sufficient? Is that sufficient to actually prove the claim, and why or why not? I don't care what community that claim belongs to. I don't care if it's a conservative claim or a liberal claim or a libertarian claim. I don't care. I want to know the argument, and that's all I really care about. And so when it comes to, are conservatives right? Are liberals right? Are libertarians right? I have this idea that I think a good rule of thumb, I wouldn't say that it's the exact middle, and I'm not concerned with getting to like the exact middle. And this is actually also related to a fallacy, the middleman fallacy. So to be directly in the middle, but I would certainly guess that on a lot of issues, when we're talking very broadly, that the answer is actually somewhere in between the two perspectives, not on one end or the other. So that's and so um, when it comes to yeah, whether or not I think people there's something innate in our genetics that is causing us to form our ideas, or it is kind of I think I'm interpreting your question two different ways. So are you saying that kind of the way society is built, do I see that as largely genetic, or based off of kind of ideas that people have? Or do I see it as, or do the ideas themselves kind of come from other ideas and their genetics? Or is it something else?
Yeah, I just know that I think the division within racism is a big problem right now. And I think that um there's a lot of misunderstanding about kind of a little bit about genetics. And um I think that there's a lot of people, especially like right now and within current events, that think that Caucasians are inherently bad. Um, and so that's kind of where I'm at with that. Um, I believe that that's a learned. I believe that if somebody is, I personally don't think that as many people are that way as what's kind of portrayed. But I think that individually, um, everybody is inherently good. Um, kind of like even bringing about like the innocence as like if you're like from a baby. I think that people are more raised into that type of mentality. I don't think that genetics really play too big of a part on whether or not you have hate in your heart or not.
I got you. Yeah, yeah. So I think I understand the question better. Yeah, I would say that it's somewhere in between. I think that there's aspects of it that are learned, but if we do look at other species or animals, tribalism is heavily embedded in other species, and it's also heavily embedded in our human history. We've seen tribalism pretty much occur and be there since the dawn of humans. So, for instance, you have the Denisovians, and you have the you have oh, why can't I remember what they're called? You have different species that were highly related to
Hmm.
humans. So, Homo erectus, and then we're Homo sapiens. And what's the one that everybody knows and talks about?
Neanderthal, is that what you're thinking of?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Neanderthals.
And I want to
Yeah.
mention that tribalism is the word that I was trying to look for. So tribalism is exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay. Yeah. And there's some good evidence that there was a lot of conflict between those groups, and that potentially we wiped a lot of them out. Homo sapiens did. And so tribalism, and it's helped us survive as an evolutionary mechanism. So it allows people to group together this idea of having the other, which is talked about in sociology. And that helps people bond. And we've actually found that there are a lot of studies done. For instance, they'll have they've done experiments with children where they'll have and this you can easily start to see this in society once we look in a lot of locations. But like, for instance, they took two groups of children to a camp, and they had them complete activities, and they became very tribalistic and hostile towards each other. And we see this in sports and competition. If you
Mm.
look at the way people behave, well, I like the Philadelphia Eagles and you like the Patriots, and so now we're enemies. And people get very aggressive about this very naturally to me. And I
Yeah,
don't,
that's a good example.
and some of this can be learned. So for instance, a lot of people I know who watch sports, their parents like the same team they like, right? Like my family are huge fanatics of, I wouldn't say fanatics, maybe that's too much, but they're very polite and kind people, but they love the Chicago Bears, and they love Chicago-based sports teams because that's where we're from. Um, and so when a new child comes into the family, the impression is usually that they're going to like the Bears too, right? And so that is obviously learned to some degree. Um, but I also know people who don't like the sports team that their parents came from or that they grew up around, and they like a different sports group. Like I'm actually a demonstration of that, even though I don't really watch sports or pay attention to it. Um, and I found that that still breeds people still get hostile around those things. So I would say it's partly genetics and partly learned. And I think, again, looking at this spectrum of, you know, is racism inherent in us, and are certain groups racist and other groups not racist? I would say that I'm looking somewhere in between all that, and I would say we probably do have some proclivities when it comes to othering people, and that this seems on some level innate. There are a lot of studies as well showing that some of these might even be unconscious.
So yeah, so now I do want to switch gears a little bit into what street epistemology is. So if you could give us a little bit of an idea about what the organization does, and then what we'll do is we'll kind of go through some of the concepts and models of it. So what is a little bit of idea of what the organization does?
So the organization is basically it funds a lot of projects, and it creates a space for people who are interested in street epistemology type conversations. That is a conversation in which, I mean, essentially what street epistemology is. We were actually just talking about this yesterday, and there's been lots of growth on this too, which I'll talk about a little bit. But the basic idea is that street epistemologists want to have conversations about what people believe and how they came to believe that, and thinking about how reliable those methods are, but in a polite way, in a polite and cordial and civil way. So, um, debate is very big in society right now, political debates or philosophical debates. Um, and there are a lot of studies showing that these aren't always the most effective conversations when it comes to persuading people. So for instance, there's a group of studies observing what's called the backfire effect. And this is where people, it seems, and actually our conversation on Friday, you did something that was unanticipated. So the backfire effect is where you would think people would be, when they're presented with data that is disconfirming of their ideas, that they would change their mind, but that actually doesn't always show up. And in fact, the backfire effect is when people are presented with conflicting data, they tend to double down on their position. And this isn't all. Again, these are a group of studies, and that's just some studies showing that. There are other studies showing where under certain conditions people will change their mind based on the data. It also depends on the type of person. So, I think one of the things that I found was interesting was I was SEing you about free will, and none of that really persuaded you much. But when I had talked to you about the Benjamin Libet experiment, which I sent you a video on, that was where you actually started to think about your confidence level. And that's not usually how it goes. People tend to not be persuaded by the facts, but end up being persuaded when you discuss, for instance, there are some studies showing that if you have a conversation about how that person came to the idea in the first place, this is what street epistemology does, and you point out the rhetorical strategies that were used to convince them, and those rhetorical strategies are seen as insufficient, that will cause a person to change their mind a lot of times. Another one is argument mapping, which I do in my classes. So having people map out arguments, so have them think about each component of their argument and how it all works together. That can cause people to change their mind. And also having groups. So having, a lot of times our beliefs are attached to groups of people. Like, so for instance, if you're religious, if you're a Christian person, it's not usually just you that's religious. Your parents are religious and your friends are religious. And so if you understand you're going to be ostracized, there's a disincentive to change your mind there. But if you have other communities that you can rely on outside of that one, that even if I change my mind and I'm ostracized, I will still be part of a social group, that can cause people to change their minds. So street epistemology is really concerned with how do we change each other's minds. It's not just concerned with changing other people's minds, but changing our own minds as well. But how do we engage in that process effectively and come to better conclusions, or first of all, better understandings of how we build knowledge, but then also better conclusions based off of how we modify our understanding of how we build knowledge. So that's really what street epistemology is about. And then SEI is just the nonprofit organization that funds a lot of those projects. So for instance, we are building a course right now to teach people street epistemology, and I'm involved in that. And so there's going to be I think, 19 module course, pretty big course, but just from beginning to end, teach you everything that we know about how to engage in conversations with people about how they came to know what they know, and how to do that effectively, do that in a way that is honest and is beneficial to both sides. So again, this idea that maybe you end up changing their mind, but also in that conversation, maybe you end up changing your mind. And to utilize the power of conversation, I think, as effectively as possible, so that we can have these conversations on controversial issues and come to some mutual understanding or agreement, I think is the main idea there.
Yeah. And so from what I had learned when looking into it and researching, was that it was pretty closely based on the Socratic method. And so if I have that definition right in front of me because I found it super interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and read the definition of the Socratic method. And this is from the Merriam-Webster definition. So the Socratic method is the method of inquiry and instruction employed by Socrates, especially as represented in the dialogues of Plato and consisting of a series of questionings, the object of which is to elicit a clear and consistent expression of something supposed to be implicitly known by all rational beings. So that just seems so that is so interesting to me. That even dating back like as far back as Socrates, this thing was kind of, just a series of questionings to kind of get somebody to express something that should be implicitly known by rational beings. And you could probably even go further into that definition, and define what implicitly and what rational means. You can kind of dig deeper into that. But can you talk a little bit about the Socratic method and kind of where it stems from?
Yeah, so I will say that that was a great definition, by the way, that because that's not always the definition that's given, but that in particular outlined how Socrates viewed the Socratic method. The people in the street epistemology community will probably disagree um, with each other on the idea of whether or not these things were implicit or not, because we're writing the course, and that's actually one of the things that we bring up. I'm not sure myself whether or not these ideas are implicit or already known by the individual. I forget exactly what the term is called, but that is the
I
idea.
I have the definition of implicity right in front of me.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Um, it is so there's two subsections. The A subsection is capable of being understood from something else, though unexpressed. And then the second definition is present but not consciously held or recognized. So it seems like it'd be like a more instinctive type knowledge.
Yeah, so I would agree with the first definition and disagree with the second one. So I definitely think that uh, it can kind of come out of people, I guess you could say, but I don't think they knew it all along, and you're just bringing it to their recall. Um, but that's just my opinion on that, and people would potentially disagree. But Socrates did believe that. He believed that when he was questioning someone, he wasn't giving them anything that they didn't already have in them. He was just kind of bringing it to the surface. And I can't remember exactly, again, what that term is. But he did believe that. And the idea is basically to, um, like, we would certainly say that street epistemology is a brainchild of Socrates and the Socratic method in some way. So the idea is to explore people's beliefs still. It is to, it usually starts with some principle that someone has, like, what is integrity to you, or what is freedom to you? And then he will go down a chain of reasoning that usually ends up in the person's coming to a different understanding of what that thing was originally, and often finding contradictions and paradoxes in that conversation. So that is definitely an aspect of this street epistemology and the Socratic method, though again, trying to do it in a friendly manner. There is some disagreement as well as to whether or not he was doing what we would call and consider maintaining rapport. That's big in street epistemology. So the idea is whoever you're talking to, you want to have the conversation in such a way that they would be comfortable having another conversation with you in the future. And I don't know if this was always Socrates's concern. Um,
Yeah.
and in the end, I don't know how much relation this had to it, but he was eventually convicted of corrupting the youth and sentenced to death by drinking the hemlock. So that's not ideal for a street epistemologist, I would
Yeah.
say, is to end up in that situation. Um, but still, that is certainly an aspect of it. And to, I guess, just briefly talk about the history here, certainly, I'm sure it even might even predate Socrates, but in terms of the street epistemology community, the term was coined by Peter Boghossian, who wrote A Manual for Creating Atheists. And that's where he came up with this idea of engaging with people. And if you read that book, if anybody reads that book, that's not what street epistemology is anymore. So he did this, I think, in like 2013. I can't remember exactly.
What was his
But
name one more time?
Peter Boghossian. And Peter Boghossian is also known for, if you happen to do any research on him, the grievance studies. So it was him and Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, and they basically did a publishing sting where they submitted a bunch of papers to gender studies um, magazines and were accepted in some of them. And that was problematic because they had basically written a bunch of gobbledygook and nonsense. And I think certain things about that I won't get into now, but that's what he's known for is pretty much those two things. But if you do read that book, it's heavily based on focusing on people's faiths and kind of it's very aggressive, let's say. And we kind of took the idea of engaging with people, even though if you read it, he clearly doesn't mean to be aggressive. He doesn't want to be aggressive, but he is being aggressive. And in some ways doing what we could see as attacking people's faiths. And what's changed is we're not interested in attacking certainly people's faiths. We're interested in understanding their faiths and even figuring out how they came to know how that's true and whether or not that's reliable. But we're also not interested in having a conversation about God or faith. That was traditionally what happened in street epistemology, but now we talk about everything from. We just had a conversation yesterday about how healthy fiber was to the diet, and somebody came in with a claim about they thought that fiber was just completely bad for you and you shouldn't eat any of it. And we examined that claim. So it is a tool that can be utilized to examine any claim, any belief, and any argument, and have a conversation about it in a respectful way.
So do you notice yourself using these methods in a general way? Or in like you're a professor, so do you see yourself using this technique like in a daily basis? Or is it more of like a practice or a hobby that you kind of indulge in just within the video production?
Definitely a daily basis.
Do you think you could use it as a tool?
Yeah. I do think that you can. I teach it heavily. I do it when I'm engaging with my students, and I've done it with friends and family and loved ones. It could be as simple as, I believe you should do the dishes tonight. Okay, well, why do you think that I should do the dishes tonight? Well, because I did them last night. Okay, well, so if you did it last night, then I should do it tonight. Is that the idea? And they say, yeah. And it's just like, okay, what if you did it last night, but I did it the whole week before? Would you say that I should still do it? And this can, and this can in some, depending on who, your loved ones are, this can be effective or not effective. And that's I think another important aspect of SC is we don't see SC as the end all be all or the solution to all the problems. We just see it as one method that somebody could use to have a more effective conversation. And yes, I do. I use it. My student got X grade, or I gave student X grade and they think they should have gotten Y grade. And it's just like, okay, why do you think you should have gotten Y grade? And they know how that's going to go. They know that process because I teach it to them very explicitly, and it doesn't always. People have to deal with their own struggles and conflicts with the answers. It's just like, so it's probably not the case that someone's ever going to be happy that they're getting an F, let's say. But if I'm listening to their reasons as to why they shouldn't, and I'm explaining to them thoroughly why I think that they should, that's the best case scenario for me in that instance, because I'm probably not going to be happy with it either way. But if they're more happy with it than they are if I had just said, well, you got it, deal with it. To me, that's better.
Yeah. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what you had said earlier about it can kind of also it's just a good means of communication to where if maybe the student would present a valid argument about why they should have gotten a better grade, and you could, it could be like vice versa as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a day where I'll do that, and nobody's ever taken me up on. So actually, I've had that conversation about a specific like something specific about their assignment, but I've actually never had someone at the end of the year argue for their whole grade. Like I got an F in this class and I should have gotten a C or something like that based off of X, Y, and Z. But certainly within a certain assignment, um, it's helped. So, and people persuade me all the time, and sometimes it's just really easy. Like, I had one student that met the page count and I miscounted, and they were just like, I think I had the proper page count, and then I went and recounted. I'm just like, oh yeah, I messed up. Apologies, and then you move on. But yeah, certainly that's an aspect, is that it tries to create a level playing field for people so that we can understand each other. And even if we can't come to agree, at least we understand where we're coming from and can think about it that way.
That kind of rolls into the next question about so what do you particularly think is beneficial about it in society? Do you think that society should learn more about it and kind of practice it more?
Yeah, I think people should learn generally about epistemology, and that's something that I hope that I can be involved in. So street epistemology basically involves, it can be used anywhere for anything, but it does basically involve just having conversations with like the average person or citizen. Um, but I would like to see some of this stuff implemented in schools. Epistemology isn't, I didn't even hear the word epistemology until graduate school, which I think is just a travesty, because here I am learning all these things and being told, hey, here's you're given stuff and here's knowledge. Okay, I guess I'll just take the knowledge, but you don't understand how people came to that knowledge and how that's true. And then you look at society and it's just like, well, people don't trust a lot of what some people consider scientific facts. And it's just like, is it any wonder they don't know how you came to conclude that? They don't have what they need to understand how you came to that conclusion. So of course they're not going to trust it. So yeah, I think that's one thing, is I would like to see it implemented. I would like to see people come to understand and study epistemology, because it's really not as intimidating as it sounds. Epistemology is a very intimidating word, but it's so intuitive a lot of times. And yes, there is complexity and nuance, but it's really not that difficult in terms of the basics, and it could certainly be taught even in K through 12. And it's just not. We just shove what we're saying is knowledge down students' throats and say, take it, rather than, hey, how did we come to know this? And to get them involved in the learning process more. So I would see this, and again, you look at society and you see people trying to shove each other's truths down each other's throats, and it's just highly toxic and highly vitriolic, and not to be like superior here, because I've even had issues with this. Certainly in the past, I've had issues with it, and street epistemology has helped me learn how to be more respectful of people and their ideas, but still make that productive, not feeling like, well, I just have to listen to what they say and accept that we're different and move on. Like I can actually do something to see if there is a chance to come to some mutual understanding and create change, while doing that in a respectful way still. And I think that's, looking at society, that is something I would say is maybe self-evident, that it could be beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that's all true. Especially if you were able to implement it, kind of like you said, K through 12, to kind of give just a general understanding of what knowledge is, where it comes from, and then kind of like what I mentioned earlier, just like really making a better distinguishing better between what opinion is and then knowledge, and realizing that there's always going to be a difference in opinion. You can argue forever about whether blue is the best color, but that's completely different and not tied to knowledge at all. And I don't think that children have that guidance, especially in school. So I think that's probably a pretty good place to stop. I really enjoyed our conversation. And what I'll do is I'll put in the description, I'll link to the Street Epistemology, any of your other personal channels that you have that you wanna get out there. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.